The Inn. A few years back, my wife Anne and I were on our way to her parents' house for the holidays. The weather had been unpredictable all day. Clear skies one minute, then a sudden downpour or a gust of wind the next. As we made our way up through New Jersey en route to upstate New York, the storm started picking up, and visibility became nearly impossible. I could barely see through the windshield as the rain turned to snow, swirling and blinding. "We need to stop somewhere," Anne said, her voice tight with anxiety. "I can't see anything out here." I nodded. The roads were getting slick, and my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We'd been driving for hours, with several more hours to go, and there was no way we'd make it in this weather. I spotted an exit, the sign obscured by snow. Feeling like I didn't have much of a choice, I took it. Fingers crossed we'd find a motel or something. A quiet stretch of road led into the darkness. The town looked abandoned, the streets nearly empty. There was no sign of life, no busy intersections, no traffic lights, not even a passing car. It felt as if time had frozen. I drove slowly, trying to get my bearings. No familiar names or chain hotels, just occasional small houses and dimly lit street lamps. Finally, I spotted a small inn on the corner of the main street. It was old, but in a charming, rustic way. 2 stories, wood-paneled, with a little porch and a flickering light overhead. Attached to the inn was a bar and restaurant, and through the frosted windows, I could see people inside. It looked like a place to rest, at least for the night. We pulled into the parking lot and hurried inside, the warmth of the inn washing over us as we stepped through the door. A burly man with a thick beard stood behind the counter. He looked up and smiled as we came in. "Welcome," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "Looks like you two got caught in the storm." We nodded and asked if they had a room available. "You're in luck," he said, grabbing a set of keys off a rack behind him. I could feel Anne relax beside me. We'd both been worried about finding a place to stay, and this seemed like a miracle. The man offered to take our bags to the room and told us to get something warm to eat. We thanked him and walked through the lobby. The restaurant area was cozy, with a roaring fireplace and a handful of patrons scattered around. It wasn't crowded, but the atmosphere was warm and inviting. A waitress, a woman in her late 40s or early 50s, with graying hair, brought us to a table by the fire. "We've got some homemade stew and hot cocoa," she said. With a wink, she added, "I can put a shot of Bailey's in the cocoa if you'd like. Perfect for a stormy night like this." We agreed and ordered right away. I'd been driving all day, and I could feel the exhaustion settling in. The food arrived, hot and comforting, and the cocoa was exactly what we needed. The man from earlier came over to check on us, introducing himself as the owner. He was friendly and talkative, giving us a brief backstory of the inn. It had been around for over a century, he said, and it had a lot of history. His wife, the waitress, chipped in with anecdotes from their many years running the place. As we ate, the storm outside intensified. Wind howled through the windows, and the snow was coming down in sheets. But the more I looked around, the more I noticed something strange. The other patrons were acting odd. They didn't speak much, and their eyes seemed distant. It was hard to put my finger on it, but something felt off. Suddenly, a loud bang came from somewhere deeper in the building. Anne jumped, and I looked around, trying to figure out where it had come from. The room fell silent for a moment, but no one seemed to acknowledge it. The owner and his wife didn't even flinch. It must have been the storm, I thought. The night dragged on, and the odd occurrences continued. A door slammed shut in the kitchen. The lights flickered, and I caught glimpses of people disappearing into the shadows, never to return. I wanted to ask the owner what was going on, but each time I tried to speak, he would change the subject with a reassuring smile. Anne seemed unsettled too, but she tried to brush it off, insisting we were just tired from the drive. Still, it felt like something wasn't right. Finally, we made our way upstairs to our room, hoping to get some sleep and leave the weirdness behind. But as we lay in bed, the noises didn't stop. It was like the inn itself was alive. Creaks, bangs, whispers in the halls. The storm howled outside, and I convinced myself that it was all just the wind. But the longer I lay there, the more I knew something was wrong. Anne was already asleep beside me. At some point, despite my anxiety, my exhaustion got the best of me, and I drifted off to sleep. In the dead of the night, I woke up to a scream. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Anne was sitting upright, eyes wide, looking at the foot of the bed. I followed her gaze. Standing there in the dim light from the window was a girl. At least, it looked like a girl. A pale, gaunt child in a tattered nightgown. Her skin was almost translucent, and her eyes, sunken, hollow, stared straight through me. I froze. The girl didn't move. She just stared at us, her expression empty. And then, without a sound, she began to fade. The edges of her form blurred and shimmered until she was nothing but a wisp in the air. Anne was shaking beside me, her body trembling with fear. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight. Neither of us could sleep for the rest of the night, haunted by the image of that girl. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside was quiet. We were both exhausted, but we decided to get some breakfast before heading out. I needed coffee if I was going to drive another 4 hours that morning. We sat at the same table where we'd eaten the night before, still shaken by the events of the previous night. The owner's wife came over with a pot of coffee. She filled our cups with a smile and asked, "How'd you sleep?" I couldn't help myself. "Not great," I said, still trying to shake the feeling of dread that lingered. She smiled knowingly. "Did you see Elsie?" My blood ran cold. I looked at Anne and she looked at me. Somehow we both knew exactly who she meant. "Elsie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman nodded, a soft, almost pitying expression on her face. "I thought you might, but I didn't want to get your hopes up," she said. "Elsie's a sweetheart." She topped off our coffees and walked away, leaving us stunned. Once we were back on the road, Anne pulled out her phone, still in shock. She looked up the inn online, her fingers trembling as she typed. After a moment, she glanced over at me, a look of exasperation on her face. "So we spent last night in the most haunted inn in New Jersey," she said softly. I stared at the road ahead of me, unable to form words. I guess most of the guests know that going in. I wish we had. Maybe we would have just braved the storm after all. The woman in the snow. I was driving home from the office Christmas party, the clock edging toward midnight. The roads were empty, just the faint hum of tires on asphalt and the soft glow of streetlights casting shadows on the snow-covered countryside. The snow had just started to fall, light flakes drifting down in the headlights, making everything feel eerily quiet and isolated. I was on a stretch of country highway, far from civilization, when I saw it. A car flipped upside down in a ditch, its headlights dim but still flickering. My heart skipped a beat. I immediately pulled over, the tires crunching on the fresh snow as I shifted into park. Getting out of the car, I scanned the scene, looking for signs of life. There, standing on the shoulder of the road, was a young woman. She seemed shaken up, but shockingly, she wasn't hurt. No blood, no obvious injuries. Her clothes were a little dirty, and her red parka was dusted with snow. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice muffled in the falling snow. She didn't answer right away, just stared at me, her eyes wide and distant. "I'm fine," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. I started to worry. She didn't seem right. She was acting strange, her answers more cryptic than coherent. "Are you sure you're okay? You were in that car, right?" She looked over at the car, a blue sedan, and then looked back at me. She smiled, a strange, distant smile. "I'm fine, just tired." She took a shaky step toward me and reached her hand up towards my face, lightly brushing my cheek. Her skin felt like ice. "You're very sweet to stop," she said softly. I shivered involuntarily. "How long have you been out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "A long time," she replied cryptically, her gaze unfocused. I didn't like the sound of that. She was either in shock or something else was going on. "We need to get you somewhere warm," I said. "Let me help you to my car." I gently guided her toward my car and had her sit in the passenger seat. I cranked up the heat and turned on the seat warmers, hoping that might help. "You could have a concussion and maybe even hypothermia," I said. "I'm going to call 911. But as I fumbled with my phone, I realized there was no service. I groaned under my breath. Of course, we were in the middle of nowhere, God knows how many miles from the nearest cell phone tower. I stepped out of the car, holding my phone up high, hoping for a signal. I called out to her. "There's no service," I said. I was about to offer to drive her to the nearest town, but when I turned back toward the car, I froze. She was gone. I checked the car. She wasn't there. No footprints in the snow. No sign she'd ever been there at all. I stared at the empty seat where she'd just been, my heart pounding. And then I looked back at the ditch where the car had been. It was empty. The blue sedan, which had been flipped over just minutes ago, was no longer there. I walked up and down the road, the snow crunching under my boots. There were no tire tracks, no evidence that a car had been anywhere near there. And there was no way that woman could have flipped it back over anyway. It was as if everything had vanished into the snow, leaving no trace behind, or like it had never been there at all. I was shaking now, not just from the cold. Something wasn't right. I got back in my car, my hands still trembling, and drove away, my nerves a bundle of frayed wires. About 5 miles later, I pulled into a truck stop diner. It was small and warm, the kind of place that catered to locals. I sat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, needing something to calm my nerves. The waitress set the coffee down in front of me without saying a word. I took a sip, trying to relax. As I ate my pie, 2 police officers walked in and sat down a few seats away. They nodded at me, and I nodded back, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to the officers. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "You haven't by any chance heard about an accident about 5 miles up the road, have you?" The officers exchanged a quick look. The waitress, who had barely acknowledged my presence up to that point, looked up at me, then at them. "What kind of accident?" one of the officers asked. "A single car," I said. "A blue sedan, flipped over on the side of the road." The officers looked at each other again, and the air in the room grew colder. "A young woman?" one asked, as if he already knew the answer. I nodded. "Yeah, brown hair, red parka." "That's Melissa," he said, almost casually, like this was a conversation he'd had 100 times before. "We get reports about her every winter. Always in the same spot, same accident, same woman." I stared at him, confused. I don't understand." "The accident you saw?" the other officer said. "It didn't happen tonight." "What do you mean?" I asked. "It happened years ago," he said. "Must be 8 or 9 years ago now." He paused, like he didn't want to tell me the next part. "She died at the scene," he said finally. My heart dropped into my stomach. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to put the coffee cup down before I dropped it. "But I saw her," I said, barely able to speak. "I talked to her. She was real." The officers exchanged a final look, their faces pale. "Yeah," one of them said, sympathy in his voice. "She was." The Farmhouse. This happened when I was in my early 20s, long before cell phones were omnipresent. I was driving through a rural stretch of highway, miles away from anything, when my car broke down. No warning, just a sputter and then silence. It was the middle of winter, and the temperature was dropping fast. There wasn't a soul in sight. The snow started falling slowly at first, but within minutes it was coming down hard, swirling around me, the visibility dropping with each gust of wind. I checked the time. Late. Probably too late to expect anyone to drive by while I froze in my car. I didn't much want to wander around in the snow, but didn't see much of a choice. With no other options, I decided to try walking. I wasn't sure where I was heading, but I figured I'd find something, a house, a gas station, anything, eventually. I wasn't prepared for the cold, and the wind stung my face with every step I took. The snow was thick now, blurring everything around me. I was regretting my decision to leave the car when I finally saw something through the white haze, a faint glow of light in the distance. At first I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes, but then it got clearer, and I realized it was a house. With a new sense of hope, I pushed on, fighting through the snow, my feet sinking deeper with each step. My body screamed for warmth, but the lights were closer now. Finally, I reached the house, a small farmhouse, quaint but charming in the way it stood alone against the storm. The porch light cast a welcoming glow. I knocked on the door, and within seconds, it opened. An elderly couple stood there, both of them in their 70s, smiling warmly at me. "You must be freezing," the woman said, ushering me in before I could even say a word. "Come in, dear, come in. We've been waiting for someone to stop by." They were so friendly, so eager to help. The man introduced himself to George, and the woman was Ruth. They took my coat and asked if I'd like some food or some cocoa to warm up. I was hesitant. Something felt strange, but what else could I do? The storm was howling outside, and I had no other choice. I would freeze to death out there. I sat down at their small kitchen table, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. The house was nice, cozy even, but something didn't sit right. There were pictures on the walls, but the pictures in those photos looked older than they should be. Old-fashioned clothes, old-fashioned hairstyles. And then there was Ruth and George. They seemed eager to have a house guest. Too eager. And why on earth would they have been waiting for someone to stop by during a storm like this? "We don't get many visitors these days," George said, as if he was reading my mind. "It's so nice to have someone here, especially in a storm like this." Ruth nodded, her eyes never leaving me. "It's been so long. We used to have company all the time." They kept talking like that, going on and on about how nice it was to have me, like they hadn't spoken to anyone else in years. But still, they were kind, offering me warm food and drinks, trying to make me feel at home. I was uncomfortable, but I couldn't exactly say why, and I had nowhere else to go anyway. They showed me to a small room where I could sleep. It was warm and the bed was soft. I'd never been so grateful for a bed in my life. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too still, too perfect. The furniture was too old. Everything seemed locked in time. I heard noises throughout the night, creaks and groans, like the house itself was shifting. The wind howled, but it was the quiet, the silence in the house between the gusts that unnerved me the most. I wanted to stay awake, to make sure I wasn't imagining things, but I was so exhausted. Eventually, sleep won over, and I drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was peeking through the window. I stretched, my body sore from the cold and tension, but when I sat up, I froze. The room was empty other than the bed I was lying in. The walls were cracked, and the floor was covered in dust. A chill swept through the room, the warmth I had felt the night before slipping away. I walked through the house, calling out for Ruth and George, but there was no answer. The house was completely empty, abandoned, and seemed to be falling apart. I couldn't understand. Just last night, Ruth and George were here. They welcomed me into their warm, cozy, lived-in house, and now everything was gone. From the peeling paint to the sagging roof, the house looked like it hadn't been lived in decades. I zipped my coat and stumbled out of the house, hurrying back to the main road. I must have walked for miles before a trucker finally passed by. He radioed for help, and soon I was in the back of an emergency vehicle, being taken to safety. It's been more than 20 years since that night, and I can't explain it. Most people think I'm making it up. My husband swears I must have been hallucinating, maybe suffering from hypothermia or something. But I know the truth. The farmhouse is still out there somewhere, buried under the snow, waiting for the next lost soul to find it. Thanks for listening, friends. If you enjoyed these spooky and allegedly true winter ghost stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you next time with more whispers from the pines.